Well, it is kind of a fun adventure going through the book of Esther, but it is a little challenging. Here's one of the challenges. Every week I come in and give a recap, and if this thing carries on too much longer, the entire message is going to be a recap. And what we're trying to do is just kind of unlayer it a bit at a time and try to kind of come to an understanding of where we are and get some nuggets that we can grow with and understand as we're reading through this. So Esther, like they said, is one of the few books, one of two really, that doesn't mention God specifically by name. And matter of fact, when it opens up, it mentions nothing about God's chosen people, the Israelites or the Jewish people, until we get into chapter 2. And so the setting is, we're seeing King Ahasuerus, better known as King Xerxes, is having a large banquet in his summer palace of Susa. Now, King Ahasuerus is the most powerful guy probably known in the world, that this kingdom known to man at that point in time as well. So he is very prominent, but he's only been in his role for about 3 years, throws a huge banquet. All of his officials, they come in, and he is really just trying to show off all of his stuff, at least as the Bible indicates. History, though, as you read through different manuscripts, would tell us that he's probably preparing for an invasion into Greece in this process. So maybe trying to get these guys all on the same page and trying to boost their morale as they embark on this journey. But then he follows this 6-month time frame of entertaining these officials with an open feast to everybody, rich and poor. And it's got an open bar, and you can drink as much as you want. And the king helped himself to it as well, because by the 7th day, he makes a really, really dumb decision. And that is that he needs to show off one more thing, something that only he has. That's his wife, Queen Vashti. And so he asks her to be brought in so that she can display her beauty before all these men who have, of course, been drinking there along with the king. And she says no, rocks his world. He is furious about it. And so he goes to his council, his buddies, and says, what are we going to do about this? And they, in their own selfish pursuits, say, we need to put an end to this, because if she doesn't submit to you, our wives are never going to submit to us. So remove her from your presence. Write an edict saying that these women need to be submissive, that men need to keep their wives submissive, and then go out and find a new, improved, more beautiful queen. And so he agrees to that, begins his search, gathers together a bunch of really good-looking virgins into the palace to be beautified for a year. Among them is Esther. Esther is by the Jewish faith, living with her cousin Mordecai. Mordecai and Esther are kind of keeping their faith, it seems, on the down low, and he tells her not to mention it as she's going through this Miss Persia kind of contest. And so she does just that. She follows him. Now, it's kind of interesting that we're seeing that there in this pagan empire is this Jewish family, and this Jewish family is just kind of like making a little bit of an entrance. And it seems obscure, really, at this moment in time. But Esther gains favor inside of this year-long beautification process with one of the king's eunuchs, one of the guys that is told us is castrated, and they take care of the women. Okay, so they've went through extra measures to make this happen. And not only does she gain his favor, but also the favor of the king. And so then she becomes queen. Queen Esther has a feast in her honor to mark this momentous occasion. And then chapter 2 winds up with this story that just really doesn't seem like it fits. And we're going to unpack this story maybe a little bit more so today. So Mordecai, Esther's cousin, is there at the gate to the palace, and he overhears two of the king's servants, the eunuchs, talking about how they're planning to kill the king. And so he tells his cousin Esther, who tells the king, who researches the plot, finds it to be true, executes the eunuchs, and big hooray, big party. No, not so much. No raise, no promotion, no anything for Mordecai, just a footnote in history. And then you open up to the next segment, which is some years later, and the king has appointed another man, Haman, to be second in command over all of Persia. And his name is Haman. Haman is an Agagite, which means almost nothing to us. But there was a man by the name of Agag who was king of the Amalekites. And he was an enemy of the Israelites. So the Israelites, God's chosen people, the Amalekites, not so much, right? And so God told the Israelites, and specifically King Saul, the first king of Israel, that they needed to destroy the Amalekites, but they didn't do it, right? And so now here we are, years later, in Persia, and there they are. There's Haman of the Amalekites. He's an Agagite. And so this is an enemy of the Jews. And the tension is beginning to build here between Haman and Mordecai. And Haman has this decree issued by the king that everybody needs to bow down to him. I wonder if he's maybe kind of full of himself a little bit. And among those people that he walks by day after day is a man by the name of Mordecai. And Mordecai is refusing to bow down. Haman doesn't realize it at first, but his officials do. They question him, and they find out that one of the reasons that he's given them is that he is a Jew. So now he's making this known, right? We don't know much of the detail about this other than they finally go and tell Haman. Haman is outraged that Mordecai is not bowing down, but he doesn't just want to eliminate Mordecai, but all of the Jews. And we can see that any time in history where this has been a thing, God has made it not a thing. And so in this situation, though, Haman is now planning. He's plotting against the Jewish people. But he needs to get the king on his side. So he starts rolling this die known as a pur. And it's like this seeking of God's favor, not the one true God, but God's favor of what to do in this situation, when to approach the king and when to execute the Jews. And so he learns that in the 13th of the 12th month, 13th day of the 12th month, that's when he's supposed to execute them. So he goes, he approaches the king, he tells him half of the story. Hey, there's this group of people, they're rising up against you. You need to do something about it. And so I'll even pay for it to happen. King gives him his ring, his power of attorney to go and write this law. And so he does. He writes the law to kill all of the Jews, to take all of their stuff on the 13th day of the 12th month. And this is all happening on the 13th day of the first month. 11 months they have to kind of stew in this environment. Now, whether this is just so he can gather all the troops and make one big swoop and annihilate them, or this is an opportunity to make them kind of squirm a little bit, no idea. But this is the plan. And so they send it out to messengers, and the community of Susa is thrown in an uproar. Among those who hear about this decree is Mordecai. Mordecai, obviously, he works around the palace, but he comes in and he is not wearing his normal work attire. He's sad, right? He's brokenhearted. He is wearing what's described as sackcloth and ashes. Clothing ascribed to the poor people. It's an act of humility and oftentimes an act of repentance where they would seek out God's favor. Now, we're not told that in the text, because again, it doesn't mention the name of God, but he humbles himself and he enters into the courts where he publicly in his mourning declares, I am a Jew. And Esther's servants, some of them realize there's a connection between the two, and so they say, hey, something's up with Mordecai, you need to figure this out. So she gets some clothes put together and sends them out to Mordecai so that he can enter the palace, because in the sackcloth it wasn't permitted. It was kind of like they viewed it as unclean, and he couldn't come into the palace. But he refused those garments because his mourning was so deep. He was so troubled. But he did send a message to Esther that there is a decree that's been issued, right, to kill all of the Jews. And Haman did it, and Haman even is paying for it, right? And so this message goes back in with Esther, as well as kind of this inquiry of her. Will you go talk to the king? And when Esther gets this, it's obviously going to cut her pretty hard. And I think that in my understanding and in my experience, like sometimes I make some decisions and I talk it over with different groups of people. Like I'll talk it over with the church leadership, I'll talk it over with staff, and I'll talk it over, and this is really sad because my wife is one of the staff, right? But she doesn't like work here all the time, and so Josh and I will have this internal conversation, and then an event will arise, and oh yeah, by the way, this is happening. It's like, oh, yeah, didn't maybe communicate that at home like it should have. But anyway, word never gets to Esther. Like she's just finding out about it. Oh, like death warrant on my life. It would have been good to know maybe that this is happening. And so she says, you know what, I can't approach the king, because if I do and the king doesn't request me, then it's certain death. But then Mordecai has a response, and this is the section that's probably the most famous of all of Esther, because he says, you know what, don't think that just because you're the queen, just because you're in the palace, that this is going to pass you by, that you're safe. Right? If this decree goes through, you're as good as dead too, and God will provide deliverance from another place. And in my mind, the biggest statement of faith in all of Esther, that if this doesn't work out, God's plan is bigger, His promise is bigger, His provision is bigger, that hope will come from another place, deliverance will come. But Esther, hear me out, perhaps this is the reason you're here and you have the position you have. And it kind of speaks to us, because I don't know where you are or what God has blessed you with or what kind of tools you have in your life or experiences you've received, that you and I perhaps have been prepared for exactly what God has placed in front of us. And if we don't rise up to do what God has called us to do we believe that God is still going to make it happen even if He doesn't use us? I believe that He will. And I believe sometimes God uses us even if we're not willing and able. We just don't get the credit for it. We don't get to be a part of that favor. And so Esther kind of relents, and maybe like she's in a tough situation. Like, hey, if I go talk to the king, I'll probably die. And if I don't talk to the king, I'll probably die. So, hey, by the way, let's fast, which is a way of, again, seeking the favor of God, oftentimes accompanied with prayer to God, repenting for whatever's going on, seeking His provision in life. But again, none of that is expounded upon. Just, hey, go fast for 3 days. And I'm going to do the same. And at the end of 3 days, I'll go talk to the king. And if I die, I die. And then the next chapter opens up. And Esther, dressed in her royal garments, goes into the king. The king sees her, and he does the one thing that allows her to get off the hook. He extends his royal scepter. It's an extension of his grace, right? Inviting her into his presence. And so she does what any person would need to do to enter that. She reaches out and touches that scepter, in receiving the grace, comes in. And I can't help but imagine that he also knows this is a huge risk to Esther in her life to come into his presence. It's been 30 days since he's sent for her. And here she is. So Esther, this isn't in the Bible that we provide, but this is how I hear it. Esther, what's going on? Like, why would you risk your life to come in and talk to me right now? And her response just befuddles me, right? Because it's, hey, I've prepared a feast, let's go eat. Oh, and by the way, let's bring Haman along with. And it just, in that moment, like, it doesn't seem to make sense, but I think that what we're going to see as we unpack the story today is that Esther is kind of beginning this long road to bring Xerxes along on her journey. She's buttering him up so that she can make the request, and he is not as callous to it. He's not as oblivious to what's going on from her standpoint. Maybe more likely to see things her way. So what we know after this first banquet, Haman is ecstatic, right? Because he goes home, he's like, mind's eye, like, I have a healthy imagination, if you haven't figured that out. I picture him like whistling and skipping, and he's on the way home, and I have just had a banquet with the king and the queen, and I'm the only other person that was invited along this journey. And so as he's making his way home, ecstatic to tell everybody how great his day in the office was, he encounters Mordecai, who doesn't bow to him. And it's just like he's on top of the world, right? Everything is going great. And then Mordecai happens, the rug is pulled out, he's sucker punched in the gut, it takes the wind out of him, he stumbles back a couple steps, and as he makes his way home, he's like, oh, this was so great, all this happened, but it's all lost if Mordecai is allowed to continue to do this, right? His pride and this arrogance of Mordecai, how dare him come against me? And so they plot. They plot to hang Mordecai. It appears in Scripture that it's like on a gallows, like hung with a noose. But we hear in history that the Persians were known for constructing these stakes, and they would impale people on a stake. Given the choice, I think I'd choose neither. right? Neither one sounded like a whole lot of fun. And whichever the case might be, he is preparing to execute Mordecai, his enemy. Tells us that this gallows is 75 feet tall. That's ridiculous. It's huge. But then we encounter chapter 6, which is where we pick up today. And so in chapter 6, page 413 in the Bibles we provide, we see the story unfold a little bit more. And it just so happens on the night of the first banquet, on the eve of the second banquet, because Esther is bringing him to the next one before she unfolds her strategy. Just so happens the king can't sleep. I don't know if any of you guys have ever battled insomnia. I know that I have. Right? And there's a few things, tricks that maybe we learned along the way. One of those is like a fan. I love having the fan on and having the noise of that fan. And it doesn't matter if I have to wear like 3 blankets, which is usually not an issue. It's just not me. But that noise helps. Like a sound machine. Anybody have a sound machine? Like you can hear the waves crash against the beach, right? The wind is whistling through the trees and you're trying to get there. Sometimes I'll even turn on the radio, or anymore it's an app on my phone and I can set a timer and it'll go off after a period of time, but it just kind of helps get me there. Like my mind helps get me disconnected. But I think one of the things that I've learned is that reading and I, like, we don't oftentimes go hand in hand, but late at night is like a catastrophe waiting to happen. Like you start reading, you're like, this is just the intro, page 2, right? And so this isn't the best time maybe to read this. And the only thing that maybe would take that to another level, like see here it says that the king couldn't sleep, so he gave orders to have the book of memorable deeds and the chronicles read before him. And perhaps there's a chance that he wants to know all these great things that have been accomplished in his reign, but perhaps there's also this understanding that this is a really boring book. Let's bring that in and see if that works. I don't know. But I read this and I'm like, oh, who is that guy? Like, it's, Ben Stein, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, right? Here's a picture of him from the movie if you can't remember him. Very monotone. Ever have a teacher like that? Very monotone. Right, so he's reading this and he's, anyone? Right? So along in this passage, he comes to this section that happens to be about Mordecai. Remember that footnote at the end of chapter 2? And Mordecai overhears the plot to kill the king. This is like 5 years later. And he's hearing this story and he goes, has anything been done for Mordecai? No, well, we need to fix this. Again, is this like 2 a.m.? Is this like 5 a.m.? All we know is it's at night, right? But at that moment, the king feels the need to fix this ASAP. And so he tells his official, like, hey, is there anybody in the courtyard? Oh yeah, Haman's out there. What in the world's Haman doing there? Well, I'm guessing the king wasn't the only one with insomnia. Like he was probably, busy building a gallows, kind of scheming against how he's going to come in and talk to the king. Maybe he's going over his script like, I need to let the king know that this is going down. So Haman is in the courtyard, and so the king sends for Haman to come in. Haman gets there. Before Haman can unload about his plan against Mordecai, then the king is like, what would you do if there was somebody that the king wanted to honor? What should we do about that? Immediately, Haman, absolutely full of himself, it's like, he must mean me. Right? This is got to be about me. And so as he's unpacking this, he's already second in command. People bow down to him, but he's like, what could I do? And so his scheme, as we look at this, is like he wants the king's robe. The one that he's already worn before. And everybody knows, like, this is the king's. It's kind of like that official game day jersey, been sweating and everything, signed autograph. Like, this is the king's. And he wants to ride in on the king's horse, one that the king has already ridden before. And he wants a crown placed upon this horse. And he wants somebody to usher him in, one of the king's officials to usher him in, saying, hey, this is what should be done for the one in whom the king chooses to honor. So, oh, this is going to be great. It's going to be like I've just won this huge military victory. Everybody's going to fall down before me. I am the king of the world. Like, closest thing he could be to the king without being the king. And so, gosh, talk about a healthy imagination. Like, he just goes off the rails in no time. And the king's like, oh, that's a great idea. Go do it for Mordecai. Something in your throat? Eyes bulging? You've got to be kidding me. And at this moment in time, he can't say anything. The king has already spoken. Right? There is no chance he's got to stand up against this opposition. And in this moment, like God just flips the whole thing upside down. And this whole story that's been building for 6 chapters all of a sudden takes a turn. And we begin to see this God who's non-existent in the pages rise to the surface, because there's not a thing any one of these cast of characters could have done to orchestrate this. Right? They couldn't have placed Queen Esther in this land, made her beautiful, had her rise to the top. They couldn't have had Haman and Mordecai go at odds with one another quite like this. They couldn't have had this situation where Esther went into the king, was given grace when his former queen Vashti wasn't allowed. Right? They couldn't have organized that Mordecai would have overheard this plot and nothing would be done, and the gratification would have been delayed for 5 long years. They couldn't have organized that the king just so happened to not sleep the night after the banquet, the night before the second banquet. Right? They couldn't have orchestrated that as he's not sleeping, that the exact spot talking about Mordecai is what's being read to him, or that Haman was in the lobby at that moment. And all of these pieces are starting to come into alignment. And God is rising to the surface. And it's an exciting, exciting thing. So Mordecai is being ushered through Susa. Not just anyone is leading him. Haman has to lead him. Right? The same Haman that is just absolutely furious with Mordecai because he won't bow down. Every one of Haman's officials knows that Mordecai won't bow down. Like, it's one of those moments where you've done something so wrong and you feel like everybody's watching you, and regardless of whether they are or not, like the humiliation just envelops you. And Haman is got all of this going on in his world, and instead of going to the banquet where he's supposed to go, he goes home. And so he runs home and he's looking for any kind of relief, any kind of hope, and he doesn't find it. Matter of fact, when he goes in the house and he explains the situation, they say, well, if Mordecai is really a Jew, then you're kind of hosed, buddy. This isn't going to go your way. And so as this develops, then one of the king's servants comes in and says, oh, hey, you need to get ready. We got to go. Like, the queen's banquet is happening. Let's bust out of here. And so they get there, and now this is day 2 of the banquet. Right? We're in chapter 7. And in chapter 7, we see this banquet taking place, and again, they get through it. Only other person besides the king and the queen is Haman. And at the end of the banquet, they serve the wine, and the king again asks, Esther, what is it that you desire? And now Esther's ready to give a response. Look at chapter 7, verse 3. Then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. This is impressive. She has managed to bring the whole situation to light without mentioning any names other than herself. And now the king who has brought Esther to this point, who is proud of her, who has just extended her grace, right? in this moment, he's like, who would dare do this? Who would come after you? Let me at him, let me at him. Right? I don't know. And so he's not a happy camper. Let's just put it that way. And over in the corner is Haman, kind of squirming a little bit. Right? He's already had to lead Mordecai through the town. And now in this moment, like, uh-oh. I can't imagine really kind of how distraught he is at this point in time and how far-reaching his decree was. He didn't picture that. Like, all he wanted to do was take out Mordecai and take out all the other enemies, the Jews, and he didn't realize there was one in the palace, married to the king, married to his boss. This is bad news. Right? And at the same moment, get this, Queen Esther, she had no idea the decree had went out until Mordecai told her. The king signed off on the thing with his ring, and he had no clue. He had no clue that it was the Jews, and he had no clue that his wife was what. And so when she utters these words, it's like she could have easily said, you buffoon, you signed off on this death warrant. I'm going to be killed because of you. But in the way that she orchestrates this whole thing, it's all about save my life, save the life of my people. Oh, you got it. You got it. I'm there. I'll protect you. Right? But he's also struck, like, who would do this? And this is a scary moment, right? Because there's only two people in the room besides Esther, and Esther speaks. And she's like, it was that guy. Right? Now, I don't know how much he was squirming before, but I guarantee you he was squirming in this moment. Like, me? Me? Yeah. How much strength would it take to point out the one guy that's in the room, right? He's second in command to the king. The other queen, Vashti, has been removed from the premises. She can't see the king anymore, right? They've moved on to the next one. And so in this moment, as they're having this heated discussion, the king goes out for breath. I don't know if you do this, but like, I'm just going to go over here and think this through. I need to figure out what's going to go on. What's going to be my next step? How am I going to handle this? So he goes out. Haman stays behind. Haman runs up to the queen to beg for his life because he's kind of out of moves. But one commentary says that if you get within 7 steps of somebody within the king's harem, you could lose your life. And so he goes over to Esther, and somehow in his hurried pace, he falls on the couch where she was reclining at. Right? Could have been completely innocent. Don't know. Right? It again leaves that a mystery. What we do know is the king is not having such a good day. Have you ever had not such a good day? And then you come home and something small happens, but because you've already had not a good day, that small thing is a big thing. Your mind it just grows and your imagination is healthy and you just get out of my way. This is bad. So the king comes back in, and at that moment, Haman is there approaching this couch where his wife, Esther, is at, and he goes ballistic. How would you do this? My queen, in my palace, in my presence. Like, is there nothing you wouldn't do? And then somebody speaks up. Happens to be one of Haman's servants, right? So chapter 7, we're getting to the end of it, and one of Haman's servants says, oh yeah, by the way, king, there's more. Like last night he was building a gallows to hang Mordecai. That guy you just honored, saved your life. Remember him? Yeah. Without thinking much about it, the king just orders that Haman is executed on the very instrument of death that he's created for his enemy Mordecai. And then we come to chapter 8. 2 verses here that we're going to talk about. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. And the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and he gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. I want you to see just how this whole thing flips, right? Haman is so proud, so arrogant, so look at me. And in this moment, the whole thing has been flipped. He's beginning to think about how he can be ushered in as this conquering king. And now all of a sudden he's leading the charge for Mordecai. He's going into what he thinks is the prime opportunity, a special delight to have a feast with the king and the queen. And in he walks into what is his execution, right? And he's going to be executed on the very thing that he's intended to execute somebody else on. And then his power, second in command, is given to his enemy, Mordecai. Mordecai is now second in command. The king now knows that Mordecai is Esther's cousin. Esther is given all the possessions of Haman. And now Mordecai is ruling over those possessions. This is intense, right? But I want to share with you a couple things as we wrap up our time today. The first is this, Proverbs chapter 16, verse 18. The pride comes before the fall. Right, this is probably the best example in all of Scripture of somebody being so prideful, so cocky, so arrogant, so on top of the world, but then just have all of it taken away in an instant. Right? And you and I sometimes are victims to this. Let me share it from my world. We're celebrating 5 years of ministry. It would be so easy to say, oh, look what I've done in 5 years. Look what we've been able to accomplish. And I was the pastor and I led this charge. And I have to continually remind myself, God was planting a church long before I came into the picture. Right? And so I have to remember that. One of the ways that God keeps me humble is this, that sometimes I prepare a message and it seems like, man, everything is on point, and when I deliver it, I'm in the zone and like, wow, that was really great. And nobody says anything. And other times, like my week has just went bananas. Like I've had my issues, my family's had their issues, I've ran after church emergencies within the family, and I get to Sunday and I'm like, it would have been nice to have time to write a message. And I get up and I speak, and I feel like, man, that was horrible. And not one, but multiple people will say, oh, that was exactly what I needed to hear. Guys, that's the power of God at work. Right? The power of God at work despite everything that's going on, but also the power of God to keep a preacher humble. And God does the same thing in your life too. If you would just open your eyes to it, the times where you think like you're in the zone, that everything is lit, you are on point, right? And the way that God just pulls the rug out from underneath of you and you land on your face and go, oh, I'm not as good as I thought I was. Or the moments in time where you thought, oh, I have no idea what I'm doing. I don't know how to figure this out. Does anybody even know how bad I am at this? And God uses it to His glory. I guarantee you, if you look deep into your life, you'll see those moments. Right? And God is at work in this story. And through 7 chapters, He's been rising to the surface. And yet He's not even mentioned. Not by coincidence, but by His providence. Which reminds me of another passage, Romans chapter 8. Verse 28 says, all things work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to His purpose. Right? So when God calls us and we're obedient and we follow after Him and we have faith in Him, God provides for us. And this Jewish group of people living in Persia, a place that was so foreign, so alien, they were exiles, they didn't belong there, the world was hostile towards them, God was still at work behind the scenes doing what only God can do. And when we look back on it, this is a moment where you say, only God. Right? Only God. I can't organize this. I can't orchestrate this. I can't plan this. No matter how smart I am, I can't put this together. And I want to tell you this. It may seem like you're in the darkest hole of your life. It may seem like nothing is going right, that God is so far from you, but I want to tell you that God is a faithful God. And if God has called you and you're faithful to Him, God will not leave you or forsake you. He will always be there. He will always come through. He will always rise to the surface. And He will be glorified. And if you don't submit to Him, He'll use another. I believe it. I think that Esther points this out, right? 2 things. What's your next step? Do you need to humble yourself before God so that God can lift you up? Because if you don't, He'll drop you on your face, right? And do you need to trust the providence of God, that He's working when it seems like everything is falling apart? Where are you at today?